So there's an interesting assortment of games I've been thinking about lately that's inspired this video. Let me just lay them out for you right off the bat. These three games are 13 Sentinels, Xenoblade Chronicles 3, and Expedition 33. Now, some of you can already read what these games have in common just from the title of this video alone, but let's go over it anyway. Full disclaimer, we're going to get into some pretty heavy spoilers with all of these titles throughout this video, so just be warned while watching further. That being said, one of the big plot twists in each of these games is that the world setting that you're playing in, the world with lore that you're attached to and invested in, is not the actual world at all, but a simulated one. You learn it's a simulated reality that, in one way or another, was created by beings from an outside dimension. Beings which, we must acknowledge, are very flawed and imperfect in all of these stories. And those flaws, in some capacity, get projected on these artificial worlds and all the people we follow in these stories, including our main cast who eventually discover all this for themselves. Now, I know some of you can probably point to some other stories in media that follow this plot beat, whether they be other games or films and whatnot. I could even cite The Matrix as an easy vanilla example if we start brainstorming. But like I said in the beginning, these three games in particular have just been on my mind lately, and as someone who was obsessed with their stories while playing through each, I'm left pondering some interesting questions I feel can be derived from each. But first, let's do a quick recap of what even comprises simulation theory in general, considering the whole concept is partially what's used to form these stories. Now, we don't need to make this a whole lecture, but it's pretty much what I was just saying with how our supposed real world is actually artificial. It's the idea that all known reality isn't naturally occurring, as some science may suggest, but rather has manifested as an artificial dimension of sorts. And in so many definitions, the existence of our universe is likened to a kind of simulation that a computer can generate using all sorts of programming and tech and all sorts of deterministic formulas and functions. I think at this point many of us are familiar with this premise, but when I think about the discourse around the topic, I sometimes feel like supporters of the theory give off this attitude of there's less sanctity to reality and in turn the world than we previously thought. I feel there's this implication that notions of nature are themselves artificial and thereby just a little less meaningful. Having the choice to embrace such implications is present in the three games we're looking at, and as some of you may have guessed, maybe even from your own play sessions, this all stems from the subtle question within the narrative of each story of, so is any of this real then? If this is all just an artificial world, then surely it's not, right? While not the main thesis of any game, you can very well get into a discussion of how real the lives of our main cast in 13 Sentinels were, for example, given they explicitly tell us everyone in this world was created by AI, universal control. Theoretically, you can do the same for Ionios in Xenoblade 3 with how Origin malfunctioned in a way that it was never supposed to. And with Expedition 33 somewhat fresh in our minds, we all know convos trying to answer this question are plenty, considering this is a painted world after all. These debates we can have in respect to these stories can, interestingly enough, be applied to our world as well. We're currently at a place in human civilization where we're pondering existential questions and in some instances asking, is this world real? Or even just attributing the question to our digital spaces. Asking, is any of this virtual stuff real, as we get attached to social media, virtual realms, AI, etc. Truthfully, you could spend hours philosophically debating how to define something as quote-unquote real, but the one impulsive definition I'd come up with right now off the top of my head goes as something that unequivocally is. Okay, I know that's broad and doesn't really establish clear parameters, but I feel that sentiment, the sentiment of a thing being undeniable and authentic in its essence, is what most of us hold toward distinguishing something as real from fake. When I think about it further, I think my true definition is a bit different, but it is interesting because I think part of why we look at some things as artificial or man-made things as fake, like say our virtual realms for instance, is because they're ultimately contingent on mimicry, which can be a whole conversation in and of itself. Like, I have a whole chapter in my next book on AI and how it's based on mimicry for the worst, but I digress. Before I get into my own thoughts on defining the term real, I think there's an argument to be had by some that with the physical world, we can scientifically break down everything around us to the molecular level, like in terms of mathematically proving what things are made of, that is. And to us humans, that's the prevailing inherent composition of reality. We can study the objective first principles of how reality is molded, and it's a composition that can exist outside of and beyond us. But with simulations, you can't say that buying a sandwich from a restaurant in a simulation is a real thing. That sandwich is a virtual recreation of the idea of a sandwich, and so it's not authentic. It's not true to form, even if everyone still treats the virtual sandwich like it's a real sandwich. But like I said, this is just one argument, and while I see its merits, I don't know if I'd say it reflects my own personal feelings. For me, I think the question needs to be reframed a bit. Instead of asking whether something is just real or fake, perhaps it's better to acknowledge that there are varying degrees of realness when we talk about reality. Degrees we can perceive on a spectrum, I'd argue. For example, looking at just how real something is based on how we can engage with it using our five senses. And with something like that, you could go down a rabbit hole of looking at advanced technology and say, okay, well, if that's the case, if that's what we're working with, what about technology that can create stimulus triggering those senses in some way? Those are our core tools for engagement, so as long as those senses are being triggered, it's real, right? Or you could ask how real something is based on how accurately it obeys the laws of physics. Or you could ask how real something is based on how intensely humanity collectively believes in it, even if it's an intangible idea. The answer to these queries is dependent on the context. Like if humanity collectively denied the existence of gravity, it wouldn't make gravity any less real, but if humanity collectively denied the merit of moral ideas such as compassion among people, then one could argue that it's fake in the universe. Both of these things, gravity and compassion, can be simply labeled as quote-unquote real. But the former can exist outside of anything humans do, while the latter exists in flux, almost dependent on what humans do and give credence to as an intangible idea. There's nothing inherently in the universe that requires compassion, and even if one was to argue religion as evidence that a higher order wants such things, even that is dependent on human interpretation, which I'm sure some of you probably already know based on religious theology we don't need to get sidetracked with. The point is, the way in which these ideas are made real differs from something that exists independently, and I think that matters. Ideas can be malleable while still being authentic, while other properties of reality can be more rigid yet also be authentic. Xenoblade 3 kind of shows us this by the time you learn of this world's origins from Nia. She expresses a sentiment that the tools with the most influence on this world are essentially made real by collective will. She outright uses the term gimmicks, and we learn how they're made real through spirit and consciousness. So with that being said, if we go along with all this, what does it say about the prospect of life as it may be presented in simulations? As you make your way through these stories and learn the truth, you have the opportunity to look at all these people you've met differently in hindsight. Do these lives that have been presented to us actually matter in the grand scheme of things? Or are they just false, even if there's varying degrees of quote-unquote real? My argument is that the answer is yes, they do matter. In my estimate, the people of these worlds, within the context of their stories of course, are real. I think despite being a civilization created by AI, or a society of living paintings, or a world of reanimated souls constantly reborn over and over, these lives matter. Because at the end of the day, it's still consciousness having a sentient experience, a human experience. And I think that's the crux here. The essence of consciousness and some semblance of free will persisting despite the scuffed circumstances that manifested it in the first place. It's interesting because both Xenoblade and 13 Sentinels offer their answer in the form of a yes as well, though with Expedition, that interpretation is mostly left up to the player. Though I will say with Xenoblade, it's a tad different since Origin is literally a repository of actual souls, so you could say those lives were always real. But part of the conflict in that story is the disregard for life once it's manifested in Ionios. So the interpretation of viewing them as disposable given the rebirth cycle and in turn fake is a point of contention to some degree. But all of that being said, you may be wondering, if we can just view life as real within the context of these games, then why not have humanity build out actual simulations akin to fictional ones and immerse ourselves, or even our own creations, in them? Or maybe a better question is, why is it so wrong to commit ourselves to our current digital world in the fashion we've already seen within the 21st century? For me, there's a couple answers with that. First of all, I think that currently, humanity doesn't truly know enough about consciousness to replicate it in new creations. And I mean, we're seeing that now with AI. Again, I won't get on a tangent on this, but there's plenty of evidence to show that AI is not actually alive at the moment. Like the TLDR is, we know the tech for language learning models, chatbots, etc., blah blah blah. They're all based on increasingly accurate mimicry, to the point where some of us genuinely can't tell the difference between AI and real humans, and thus start to wonder if it's already become sentient. But we're not there yet. There's no sentience at all. So any simulation we could build out now would actually be more of an illusion than anything else. It wouldn't be like 13 Sentinels because we just don't understand the true depth of what makes something a sentient being. Discussions of science and philosophy are still trying to flesh this out, especially now in our current civilization. In terms of ourselves, however, in terms of we humans putting ourselves in simulations to live in and redefine what's considered real through our engagements, there's some problems with that too. Despite how much we've been able to build our current virtual realms, we humans still need to have an objective, physical relationship with our physical, observable reality. We need oxygen, water, physical shelter, and real food for nutrients that can keep our organic bodies alive. But of course, there's the acknowledgement that humans may simply create simulations so advanced that we eliminate the need for all that. Say we're no longer physically tethered to Earth and the needs of our physical bodies. Let's say we can retain our souls and fully project them to new dimensions of our choosing. What's so wrong then with leaving for an artificial world so long as we decide it's authentic? We've already got young people of today who are more emotionally attached to the virtual spaces on phones than regular society. So if those spaces are where their lives are truly taking place, why not say that a life lived within digital confines is real and preferable? To that I say, it's partially true. Because of how there's varying degrees of realness, like I said, there are indeed a lot of genuine, authentic things that cyberspace leaves us with as we invest parts of ourselves into it. Some of us make genuine friendships with strangers. Some of us are fortunate enough to be positively influenced by influencers at times, and some of us learn real truths about existence we would have never known otherwise. I've experienced much of that myself. Yet the overlooked thing here is in hypothetically forsaking our original reality for these new ones, all while we then build them out more and more and more as generations pass. Even if a day comes where we no longer need planet Earth for organic sustenance, I believe it ultimately amounts to this endless form of escapism, jumping from one world to the next without acknowledging the sanctity of the last. So ultimately, this is a caveat to the idea that things in a simulated reality are real, because even if we can make that determination in the way that we've discussed, it doesn't mean we can haphazardly embrace whatever fantasies we please, especially if they're at the expense of something else. And it's actually interesting because these are my legitimate feelings, but the whole idea is also reflected in the Future Redeemed story for Xenoblade 3. It very much emphasizes as well that the way in which we move forward throughout the realities available to us matters. Creating the future requires us to be at peace with everything that once was before we leave it. And yet, if humanity had these powers open to us now, can you truly say that we've learned to love and appreciate the current plane of existence we already live on? That being planet Earth? Are we in a place to be at peace with this celestial body we've engaged with as part of our fundamental existence? I would say no. When I think of all this, it ultimately makes me feel like even if our current observable universe is found to be a simulation, it doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. There's still a sanctity to be found in how intricate everything works, and it goes beyond simple binaries such as real or fake. You can say the same about free will in such contexts too, which I basically have similar opinions on. Like, to me, free will exists on a spectrum as well. We're all bound to something that you can say is the actual driver behind our actions and decisions. So yeah, we don't hold absolute freedom in how to exist in life. We're predisposed to certain ideas, lifestyles, vices even, and it gets unlikely that we'll break out of some of those pathways, and it's a tough pill to swallow once we realize this. Yet conversely, I don't believe we're solely bound in an absolute sense either. Determinism is a thing that takes hold of us at times, but it's not all-encompassing. There is room and flexibility for us to make choices that are unique and one of a kind in this reality. Ones that define our experience, our consciousness is having. Maybe that flow of consciousness in between the cracks of what's predestined is another thing that adds realness to a given reality. I think you could argue as much within the context of these narratives. I mean, they all consist of characters, trying to break out of some kind of redundant existence for the sake of something more, something greater than what was ordained for them. It should go without saying, though, that despite what I'm saying here, I don't actually think video game characters are real at all. I mean, we can prove that the same as AI, but I do think that the artistry is real, and it's art which imitates life, despite the, opposite also being true as well. So, as humans in our actual world, and more importantly as people, we try to pursue the same forms of meaning as these characters on a day-by-day basis. And with the way things are right now, I see humanity as headed toward a new inflection point of just reconsidering the higher limits of consciousness. Though such reflections are a bit of a jumbled mess right now, considering we've only just begun contemplating these existential questions across maybe the past few centuries or so. We've only just arrived at this new starting line, that is. And yet despite that, the potential for what we can manifest in our reality, simulation or not, is still insane. The upper limits for what we can make real doesn't always need to be rooted in some nihilism. There's plenty of profoundly good and wholesome stuff to be found if our spirits will just allow each other to believe and tap into it. Maybe that's a tad sappy sounding, but it's true. It's something I gather from playing games like these, and in the end, I hope others can glean the same as well.